The air in the Zenith Tower lobby was thicker than the gold plating on the walls, a suffocating mixture of expensive cologne and unspoken judgment. Lyra Vance knew silence. She lived in it, moved through it, wielding her cleaning cloth like a shield against the glittering hostility. But when the towering figure of Emir Zahir al-Massa entered, the quiet fractured. He didn't speak loudly, but the ancient words he uttered, a dialect so rare it was preserved only in brittle manuscripts, sliced through the opulent stillness. Every suit, every polished smile, every trained diplomat in the room strained to understand and failed. Yet, in the deepest shadow, by a bucket and a mop, Lyra's hands, raw from polish, paused. She hadn't moved, she hadn't made a sound, but an instinct deeper than professionalism made her dark eyes lift. The secret deal had been laid bare, and the only person who heard it, the only one who truly understood the danger, was the woman they insisted on treating like dirt. The silence in the gold room was about to become total, shattered only by a voice that shouldn't exist here. Lyra Vance, 29 years old, was humiliated right in the golden lobby of the 7-star Zenith Tower Hotel in Viridia. The room itself was a monument to excessive wealth, a spectacle of gold and glass sparkling under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. Lyra was bent over, wiping a table beneath one of those chandeliers, her hands already red from hours of polishing, her back sore from the constant bending required by her job. The hostility was palpable. Selina, the female receptionist with sharp red nails and a designer scarf draped elegantly over her shoulders, leaned over the marble counter. She scoffed, her voice low and laced with malice. "Careful, if you wipe the guest's feet by mistake, you'll lose your job." Lyra was accustomed to this. People looked at her like she was less than the very marble floor she diligently cleaned. They saw the plain white blouse and black skirt, the dark brown hair pulled back tight, the absence of makeup or jewelry, and the rag in her hand. They saw the quiet way she moved and automatically assumed she was nobody. But Lyra wasn't nobody. Not even close. The manager, Mr. Thorne, a wiry man whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl, spotted her near the entrance. He waved her off, ordering her to disappear before the royal entourage arrived. "Move!" he hissed, waving his arms at her as though she were a stray dog that had wandered in. "Don't stand there in plain sight." Lyra stepped back, her eyes lowered, folding the rag precisely in her hands. Selina seized the opportunity, laughing loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Letting a maid stand near the emir ruins the prestige," she declared. A few guests nearby chuckled, their eyes sliding over Lyra as if she were merely a piece of the furniture, easily ignored. Lyra simply bowed her head and apologized softly, slipping toward the corner. The staff had been prepping for weeks for the arrival of Emir Zahir al-Massa, the renowned oil tycoon, and his entourage. Every surface had been polished, and every smile practiced. Lyra didn't care much for the fuss. She just did her job, moving from table to table, ensuring the lobby gleamed. Her plain black flats were scuffed but clean. As she worked, a group of young influencers, dripping in branded clothes and gold watches, lounged nearby, snapping selfies with a chandelier sparkling in the background. One of them, a woman with a fake tan and a loud, grating laugh, noticed Lyra. "Oh my God, look at her shoes," the influencer announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you steal those from a thrift store?" Her friends cackled, one of them pretending to gag dramatically. Lyra's hand stilled on the table. Her jaw tightened, but she refused to respond. She didn't look up, just kept wiping, her movements slow and deliberate. The influencer leaned closer, her phone out, clearly filming. "Smile for my story, Maid lady," she taunted. In a moment that lasted only a fraction of a second, Lyra turned slightly, her eyes catching the influencer's. That brief, sharp intelligence in Lyra's gaze was enough. The woman flinched and quickly looked away. Lyra went back to her task. She had trained herself to be invisible, but her quiet intelligence stayed sharp, constantly observing the commotion. The emir entered the lobby like he owned the place, which in a way he did. His robes were crisp, and his presence was heavy, authoritative. Aides followed him, all sharp suits and dark sunglasses, their voices clipped and low. The hotel staff scrambled, bowing and offering drinks. Lyra stayed in her corner, wiping down a side table that nobody was using. She was meant to be invisible. The emir settled into a velvet chair, glanced around the seemingly compliant room, and began to speak to his team. He started talking in High Rihani, an ancient Arabic dialect so old that most scholars only read it in historical books. "No one here understands us," he said to his aides. "Speak freely." They began discussing a complex and controversial deal, the acquisition of oil fields near a sensitive border. One of the aides, a nervous man with a twitching mustache, muttered anxiously, "If anyone's recording, we're doomed." Lyra's hand paused on the table. She shook her head slightly, a subtle movement almost like she was disagreeing with the air itself. Then she pulled out her phone. She wasn't recording. Instead, she opened an application she had built herself, one designed to translate ancient dialects in real time. A middle-aged hotel guest in a tailored suit noticed her phone and immediately sneered. "What's this? Playing games on the job?" he demanded. He leaned toward Mr. Thorne, his voice loud. "You let your staff slack off like this?" Mr. Thorne's face flushed crimson. He stormed over, hissing at Lyra. "Put that away. You're embarrassing us." Lyra slipped the phone into her pocket. Her expression remained unchanged. "I was checking something," she said softly. The guest laughed, turning to the growing crowd. "Checking something like how to mop better." Sharp, cruel laughter spread through the lobby. Lyra's fingers curled around the edge of her cleaning bucket, but she did not respond. She simply picked up the bucket and moved to another table, her steps remaining steady, unwavering. One of the emir's aides, a tall man known as the apex aide with slicked-back ponytail, caught her glance. He barked, pointing a demanding finger. "Hey you! What are you looking at? Do you understand?" The entire room turned, eyes locking onto Lyra. Selina, the receptionist, snorted, folding her arms across her chest. "Don't think working here gives you the right to spy on royalty," she said. Another aide snapped, his voice dripping with disgust. Mr. Thorne rushed over, his face red with panic. "Lyra, go to the storage room now. You're banned from the lobby." Lyra's shoulders remained straight. She bowed slightly and replied, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to. I only know a little Arabic." The aides burst into laughter. The apex aide repeated mockingly, "Arabic? Since when do maids speak the language of royalty?" Selina joined in, her laugh sharp as broken glass. Lyra's fingers tightened around her rag, but her face stayed calm. She turned to leave, her steps slow and deliberate. As she reached the edge of the lobby, a young bellboy, Kai, barely 18, hesitated near her. He had seen her work late nights. She was always quiet, always kind. He leaned in, whispering, "Don't let them get to you, Lyra. They're just loud." Lyra paused. Her eyes softened for a moment, and she gave him a small, barely noticeable nod. She kept walking, but Kai's words, a tiny spark of kindness, lingered in the cold room. She tucked her rag into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a photo she kept there, a faded picture of her brother Leo. The weight of the photograph grounded her and kept her moving. She didn't need their approval, she never had. The emir, however, was watching her closely. His eyes narrowed. He leaned forward and spoke again, his voice low and clearly testing her. "If you understand, repeat that sentence using Aston prosody." The room froze. Nobody knew what Aston prosody was. Not the aides, not the manager, not even the hotel's ridiculously expensive translator, who was currently fumbling uselessly with his tablet. Lyra stopped walking. She turned, placed her hands in front of her stomach in a gesture of court etiquette, and spoke. Her voice was steady and clear. The Aston dialect rolled off her tongue, flowing naturally, as if she had been born to speak it. Perfect pronunciation. Perfect cadence, the emir stated. A silver goblet slipped from the hand of one of the stunned aides, clattering loudly onto the marble floor. The emir stood up, his rich robes rustling, and his voice cut through the absolute silence like a sharp blade. "What is your name?" Mr. Thorne lunged forward, horrified. "Silence," he hissed, practically covering Lyra's mouth. "You'll be fired," Selina whispered venomously to a coworker. "She's digging her own grave." Other staff joined in, their judgment a low, continuous hum. "Who does she think she is?" A woman from the emir's entourage, dripping in heavy gold jewelry, screeched. "Don't let this commoner stay in the room another second." Lyra bowed her head again. Her voice was soft but carried immense clarity. "I only answered because you asked." The emir raised a hand, and the room instantly quieted. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra, searching her face as though attempting to solve an intricate puzzle. His silence was louder and more commanding than any order. A young woman in the entourage, her face caked in heavy makeup, stepped forward. Her voice dripped with poisonous contempt. "Look at that uniform. It's practically falling apart. You think you can stand here and play scholar?" She smirked, turning to the crowd. "She probably stole it from the laundry." The room erupted in snickers. Lyra's hand briefly brushed the frayed hem of her blouse. Her fingers lingered there for just a moment. She didn't flinch, nor did she attempt to defend herself. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locking directly with the woman's. "It's clean," Lyra said. Her voice was so quiet it almost vanished into the vastness of the lobby. The woman's smirk faltered. Her manufactured confidence visibly cracked under the intensity of Lyra's steady gaze. An older man in the entourage, Commander Sterling, a general with distinguished gray streaks in his beard, squinted at Lyra. His hands began to shake as he pointed at her. "You were in Summit Ethel 2016, he declared. "I remember that voice. You were Nightingale." The name hung in the golden air like a cloud of smoke. Nightingale. The code name belonged to a woman who had served as the crucial high-stakes translator at a top-secret military summit. Her precise voice had been the single element that prevented two nations from plunging into war. The aides exchanged panicked glances. Mr. Thorne's jaw dropped in disbelief. The emir slowly sat back down, his hands clasped. "Why are you here working as a maid?" he asked. Lyra's eyes flickered for a second, moving toward the small, faded photo she kept hidden in her pocket, a picture of her brother Leo, smiling widely in a dusty street. "I left," she said simply. "I've done enough." The emir nodded, his face unreadable. "But today," he pressed, "I need you one more time." A junior aide, Dax, his tie too tight and his face flushed with unbridled ambition, could not contain himself. He stepped forward, his voice loud and accusatory. "This is ridiculous. She's a maid, not a diplomat." He turned to the emir, gesturing wildly. "You can't seriously trust her with sensitive matters. She's probably making it up." The room murmured in nervous agreement, the tension soaring. Lyra stood perfectly still, her hands folded. She did not argue or raise her voice. Instead, she picked up her cleaning rag, folded it neatly, and deliberately placed it on the table. The gesture was so precise, so deliberate, that it effectively silenced Dax. His words trailed off, his confidence shrinking under the weight of her quiet dignity. The apex aide wasn't easily convinced. He leaned forward, sneering openly. "You think a few fancy words earn you a seat?" He wanted to shame her. Could be a coincidence or a performance. Another aide, younger and with a smug grin, chimed in, issuing the ultimate challenge. "Prove it. Respond in Desert Sabaean." The room waited, expecting Lyra to finally falter. Lyra did not blink. She opened her mouth and began to sing a traditional folk song of the dust-torn sages tribe. Her voice was soft but hauntingly beautiful. Every single note and word was flawless. The young aide stepped back immediately, his face pale with shock. "Impossible," he muttered. "Only someone born in the sage's tribe would know that." Lyra's eyes met his, calm and steady. "I lived with that tribe for 2 years," she said. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water, rippling silence throughout the vast room. As the song faded, Chef Mateo, a burly man who had been watching from the kitchen door, dropped a tray of glasses. The crash echoed loudly, yet nobody moved. The chef, his hands covered in flour, stared at Lyra, his mouth hanging open. He had heard that song before years ago, in a remote village far from Viridia. Ignoring Mr. Thorne's desperate glare, Chef Mateo stepped forward. "My grandmother sang that," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "How do you know it?" Lyra turned to him, her face softening for the first time since the ordeal began. "I listened," she said simply. The chef nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He stepped back, clutching his apron tightly like it was a cherished lifeline. The emir stood again, this time with definitive purpose. He extended a hand toward her, his voice firm and commanding. "Lyra Vance, I want you to come with me to the diplomatic assembly in Vespera." The room gasped. Mr. Thorne, who had been pacing nervously, froze in terror. The aides scrambled to their feet, bowing respectfully. "At your service, Miss Vance," the apex aide stammered, his earlier sneer completely wiped from his face. Selena's face turned an ashy gray, her hands gripping the counter for support. Lyra untied her apron, folding it neatly over her arm. She bowed to the emir, her voice quiet but clear. "I don't need fame. I only want my voice used at the right time." She stepped toward the door, her plain black shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. Outside, news crews were already gathering, their cameras flashing. The anonymous maid was about to become a name the world would be forced to remember. Just before she stepped out, an elderly guest, Madame Dubois, a woman with a cane and a velvet shawl who had been sitting quietly in the lobby unnoticed, approached her. Her eyes were sharp and steady despite her age. "You remind me of my daughter," she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched Lyra's arm. "She never let them break her either." Lyra paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. She looked at the woman, her expression kind but unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly. Then she pushed the door open. Madame Dubois watched her go, her cane tapping the floor, a quiet pride shining in her eyes. That moment in the lobby was not the start of Lyra's story. Years ago, she had been someone else entirely. A girl born in the Republic of Kale, raised in a family so wealthy they could literally buy silence. Her father was a diplomat, her mother a scholar. They taught her discipline, the intricacies of languages, and the immense weight of words. By the age of 15, she spoke 8 languages, including rare dialects that most people didn't know existed. She used to sit at her father's desk, listening to him negotiate high-level treaties, her small hands tracing the maps of places she would later walk as an adult. But then her brother Leo died. He was caught in an airstrike on a street he shouldn't have been on. Lyra was 20 years old at the time, working for the UK Ministry of Defence, translating coded messages that were saving lives daily. When she received the news, she simply stopped. She left the job, the city, and the life. She yearned for quiet. She wanted to disappear. Years before, one night in a dusty Kale village under a vast star-filled sky, an old woman from the dust-torn sages had taught her that traditional folk song. The old woman's voice had been cracked but immensely strong. Lyra had sat by the fire, her notebook open, diligently writing down every word. The woman had touched her hands and told her, "You carry our stories now." Lyra hadn't sung that song since that night, not until today in the Zenith Tower lobby. As she folded her apron, that memory flickered momentarily in her eyes. She didn't speak of it, but her fingers lingered on the apron's edge, as if she were holding onto that village, that fire, and that sacred promise. The hotel job itself hadn't been random. Lyra specifically chose the 7-star hotel in Viridia because it was a place where power converged and moved. It allowed her to listen without being seen. She didn't need the money. Her family's substantial wealth was still available and untouched. But she needed the work, the rhythm of cleaning tables and folding sheets. It kept her hands busy while her mind, always sharp, stayed fully engaged. She would hear things, deals, secrets, and dangerous plans. And usually, she let them pass through her like a harmless wind. But that day with Amir Zahir, something crucial had shifted. She hadn't planned to speak, and she certainly didn't want to. But when he tested her with a high Rihani, it felt like Leo's voice ringing in her head. "Don't hide, Lyra. Not now." In the storage room, where she had been briefly sent to disappear, Lyra stood alone. The shelves were lined with cleaning supplies, the air thick with the acrid smell of bleach. She pulled out the photo of Leo, holding it under the dim light. His smile was wide, his eyes bright like he was about to tell her a joke. She traced his face with her thumb, her breathing slow and measured. A coworker, an older woman who cleaned the sweets section, peeked in. "You okay, Habibi?" she asked softly. Lyra nodded, slipping the photo back into her pocket. "Just thinking," she replied. The woman smiled, her hands rough from years of manual work. "You're stronger than they know," she said, and then left Lyra to her thoughts. Lyra straightened her shoulders, picked up her bucket, and walked back out to the lobby. Back in the lobby, the atmosphere was fundamentally altered. The aides actively avoided her gaze. Mr. Thorne hovered nearby, muttering apologies that Lyra did not acknowledge. Selina, the receptionist who had laughed the loudest, was nowhere to be found. Lyra stood by the Emir's chair, translating fluently as he spoke to his team. Her voice was low and perfectly precise, turning the complex High Rihani into English, then French and back again. Commander Sterling, the general from Summit Ethel, watched her intently, his hands still shaking slightly. He leaned toward an aide and whispered, "She saved us back then. Nobody else could have." Lyra didn't react, but her fingers briefly brushed the photo in her pocket. The news spread like wildfire. By that evening, Lyra Vance's name was plastered across every channel. The maid who spoke royalty's language, they called her. The consequences for the antagonists were swift and quiet. Selina was fired the very next day. Someone had leaked her vicious comments to a gossip site, and the hotel could not afford the public relations nightmare. The Apex aide also lost his job, his name tied to a failed deal that surfaced online. Dax, the young advisor who had challenged her to sing, vanished entirely from the Emir's inner circle. His social media accounts suddenly private. None of this was Lyra's doing. She didn't post, didn't call, and didn't gloat. She simply kept moving forward. The Emir's offer was genuine. Vespera was hosting a summit, a critical chance to shape borders and prevent potential conflicts before they could escalate. Lyra did not immediately accept. She returned to her small apartment, sat on her couch, and stared at the photo of Leo, his smile frozen in time. She thought of the dust-torn sages tribe, the 2 years she had spent absorbing their songs and their stories. She thought of Summit Ethel, the long, grueling nights translating under crippling pressure, knowing that one incorrect word could cost lives. She didn't want that immense weight again. But the Emir's voice echoed in her mind. "I need you one more time." The next morning she packed a small bag. No fancy diplomatic clothes, just her usual plain skirts and blouses. She didn't call the Emir's team. They had already sent a car. At the airport, a woman in a sharp suit handed her a badge. It read, "Lyra Vance, Global Head of Diplomatic Languages." Lyra looked at it, her thumb tracing the letters. She did not smile, but she nodded. At the airport, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, stared at Lyra as she waited for her flight. The girl's mother nudged her, whispering, "Don't stare." But the girl kept looking, her eyes wide. "Is that the lady from the news?" she asked, loud enough for Lyra to hear. Lyra turned, her face softening. She knelt down and handed the girl a small coin from her pocket, a worn but shiny kale reel. "Keep listening," she said. The girl clutched the coin, her face lighting up with a bright smile. Lyra stood, her bag over her shoulder, and boarded the plane. Viridia shrank below her. She didn't look back. In Vespera, the summit was pure chaos. Diplomats were shouting, translators were scrambling, and papers were everywhere. Lyra walked in, her plain skirt noticeably out of place among the sea of tailored, expensive suits. People stared and whispered, but she did not care. She sat at the main table, her voice steady and measured, translating complex dialects that nobody else in the room could handle. When a particularly tense moment arose, a border dispute where two stubborn sides refused to budge, Lyra spoke one crucial sentence. She quoted a revered ancient poet in Hairihani, a figure both sides held in immense respect. The room went completely quiet. The deal moved forward. Nobody mocked her now. During a short break, an older diplomat with foggy glasses approached her. He had been at Summit Ethel years ago, then only a junior officer. "I never thanked you," he said, his voice low with respect. "You kept us alive that night." Lyra looked at him, her hands still. She nodded once, then turned back to her notes. The diplomat stood there for a moment, his hands clasped, wanting to say more but understanding that she wouldn't want it. He walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of an unpaid debt. As the summit continued, a young translator, barely out of college, hovered near Lyra's seat. Her hands shook as she clutched her notebook, her eyes wide with open admiration. "I studied your work," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your translations from Ethel, they're in my textbook." Lyra paused, her pen hovering over a page. She looked at the girl, her expression soft but guarded. "Keep studying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded, her face lighting up with profound gratitude, and she scurried back to her seat, clutching her notebook like an invaluable treasure. The news crews followed her to Vespera too. They desperately wanted interviews, photos, and her full story. She gave them nothing, not a single word. She would slip out of meetings, her head low, her steps quick. One day, as she left the conference center, a persistent reporter finally caught her attention. "Miss Vance, why hide? You're a hero." Lyra stopped, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm just done talking." She turned and walked away, her small bag slung over her shoulder. Back in Viridia, the hotel was completely different. The staff whispered her name like it was a legend. The new receptionist, a young woman with nervous hands, kept a photo of Lyra on her phone, clipped from a news article. Mr. Thorne, the manager, sent her a desperate email apologizing and offering her job back. Lyra did not reply. She didn't need to. Her life was no longer there. Months later, at a summit held in the Thames Congress Centre in London, a tall, quiet man arrived. His presence was heavy like a silent storm cloud. This was Lyra's husband, Elias. Nobody in the diplomatic world knew she was married. Not the emir, not the aides, not the news crews. Elias didn't speak much. He simply stood silently by her side as she translated. When an aide from Viridia, one of the few who had mocked her and survived the consequences, saw him, he froze instantly. The man's name didn't need to be spoken. His family's immense wealth and power filled the entire room. The aide instantly looked away, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Lyra did not react. She just kept translating, her voice steady, her eyes focused on the papers before her. At a quiet moment in London, Lyra stepped outside. The city's lights reflected brightly on the wet pavement. A street musician played a soft, melancholy tune, his fingers moving over a battered guitar. The melody was instantly familiar, an old Kale lullaby that her mother used to sing. Lyra stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She dropped a coin into the musician's case, her fingers trembling just slightly. The musician nodded, not knowing who she was, but his eyes held hers for a moment, as if he saw something she chose not to say. The quiet consequences continued to unfold. Selina's career never recovered. Her name was toxic in the hospitality industry. The Apex aide attempted to start his own consulting firm, But no one in the high-stakes world trusted him after the leaked deal. Dax was dropped entirely by his powerful sponsors. His smug grin now long gone. Lyra never chased them down or publicized their failures. She didn't need to. The truth did the work in the end. Lyra stood at a window in London, looking out at the city. Elias stood silently beside her, his hand gently brushing hers. She didn't need to explain herself. Not to him, not to anyone. She had spent years of her life being judged solely by her clothes, her menial job, and her quiet way of moving. But she had never bent, never begged, and never lost herself. The world saw her now. Not as a maid, not merely as a cryptographer, but as a mirror. A powerful, quiet reflection of dignity.